In a medieval kingdom where power speaks and the poor remain silent, a village bell tolls as royal guards drag away a young peasant girl. They call it punishment. The king calls it a lesson in submission. But in the coldest corners of the castle, where shadows hide centuries of cruelty, something unexpected is about to unfold. When she speaks the words no commoner has dared utter, "You may imprison my body, but you cannot silence my spirit," the king's cold eyes reveal a flicker of something dangerous, curiosity. As walls of privilege crumble and truths long buried come to light, the fate of an entire kingdom hangs on the most unlikely of questions. What happens when a ruler who has never truly seen his people finally opens his eyes? The village bell still echoed across the marketplace when the king's soldiers burst through the crowd, their armor catching the late afternoon sun like shards of ice. Blood drained from faces as the men dragged a young peasant girl through the parting throng. Her wheat-colored hair clung to tear-stained cheeks, but what pierced the onlookers' hearts wasn't her crying. It was her silence. She didn't beg. Instead, her eyes swept across the crowd, meeting the gazes that quickly dropped away, ashamed of their powerlessness. The king himself sat mounted on his midnight stallion, observing her with the cold calculation of a man selecting livestock. Something in the callous tilt of his head made mothers pull their daughters closer and men clench their useless fists until knuckles whitened. The marketplace stilled to unnatural quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The girl's feet left small crimson prints in the dust where her worn shoes had split open. A child whispered, only to be silenced by its mother's trembling hand. The girl's father had tried to intervene. His body now lay crumpled against the baker's stall, chest rising and falling in shallow, uncertain rhythms. No one dared help him. Not yet. Inside the castle walls, stone corridors swallowed all warmth. The girl, Ilara was her name, though none of the guards had bothered to ask, was pushed forward by rough hands that left bruises like ink stains on her skin. Her heart hammered against her ribs so violently she feared they might crack. The great hall loomed ahead, its vaulted ceilings disappearing into shadow despite the afternoon light streaming through stained glass. Lords and ladies lined the walls, their jeweled finery a grotesque contrast to the dirt streaking Ilara's homespun dress. Their faces showed neither sympathy nor malice, only the vacant curiosity of people watching an unusual spectacle. "Kneel before your king," a voice commanded, and Ilara felt pressure on her shoulders forcing her down. Her knees struck the stone floor with a dull crack that sent pain shooting up her spine. The king descended from his gilded throne, each footstep echoing like a death knell in the cavernous space. Up close, she could see he wasn't old, perhaps 30 summers, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the hardness etched into every line. His eyes were the palest blue, almost colorless, like water with all life drained from it. "Do you know why you're here, girl?" His voice carried no anger, which somehow made it worse. This wasn't personal to him, just power being exercised because it could be. Ilara's throat closed around unspoken words. The taste of copper filled her mouth where she'd bitten the inside of her cheek to stop herself from crying out. She shook her head, a barely perceptible movement. "You will serve as my personal chambermaid," the king announced, loud enough for all to hear. "To remind me and everyone in this court of the proper place of commoners." His lips curved into what might have been a smile on another face. "And to remind your village what happens when they fail to meet their tax obligations." A whimper escaped an elderly woman near the back of the hall. Ilara recognized her as Lady Marrow, once her mother's employer before illness had taken both her mother and her position in the household. The sound was quickly stifled. Ilara's mind raced with memories of her father working himself to blood and bone in the fields, of her little brothers with their hollow cheeks and too large eyes, of her village's desperate struggle after the blight had taken half their crops. The taxes had been impossible. Everyone knew it. This was punishment, not justice. Exhaustion and terror made her limbs leaden, but something else, something that burned hotter than fear, gave her strength to stand. The guards moved to push her down again, but the king raised a hand, curious at this small rebellion. Ilara raised her head and met the king's gaze directly. The hall seemed to hold its collective breath. She could feel her legs threatening to buckle, but she locked her knees and stood straight. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, yet in the stunned silence, it carried to every corner. "You may imprison my body, your majesty, but you cannot silence my spirit." The words hung in the air like an invisible blade. The court froze, waiting for the king's rage. Even the guards tensed, uncertain whether to strike her down. No peasant had ever dared speak to the king this way, certainly not a slip of a girl covered in dirt and blood. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on every person present. The king's face remained unreadable, his pale eyes studying her as if seeing something unexpected. For a heartbeat, one terrible suspended moment, Ilara thought she saw something flicker in those cold depths. Not anger. Something more unsettling. Curiosity. The entire hall seemed to shudder collectively, a wave of disbelief passing through the assembled nobility. A lady-in-waiting dropped her embroidery hoop, the wooden circle clattering against stone with a sound like breaking bones. The court astrologer, an ancient man with eyes like dark wells, leaned forward in his seat, suddenly alert, as if witnessing the alignment of stars long foretold. The king's face hardened once more, but there was that strange light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He turned to address the court, his voice sharp enough to cut. "It seems our new servant requires education and proper respect." He gestured to the guards without looking at them. "If she won't obey through force, I shall teach her myself." Ilara felt ice spread through her veins at his words, not a threat of death or torture, something far more intimate and terrifying. As the guards gripped her arms again, she caught a glimpse of Lady Marrow's face. The old woman's expression wasn't fear or pity, it was recognition, as if she had seen this scene before and knew how it would end. The last thing Ilara saw before being dragged from the hall was the king watching her, his head slightly tilted, like a predator considering not just how to kill its prey, but how to play with it first. Dawn broke with hesitation over the castle walls, as if the sun itself feared what lurked within the stone fortress. Ilara's fingers were raw and bleeding after scrubbing the great hall's floors through the night. The bristles of the brush had worn away her calluses, leaving nothing but tender flesh that stung with every movement. Yet her posture remained unbowed as she worked, a silent defiance that seemed to radiate from her very being. The nobles passing through the hall deliberately tracked mud across her still wet floors, their laughter cutting through the morning quiet like knives. One particularly cruel lady-in-waiting accidentally spilled wine near Ilara's finished section, the dark red liquid spreading like blood across the stones. Something flickered in Ilara's eyes, not submission, but a carefully banked fire. "Again," the overseer commanded, his voice flat with disinterest. "And be grateful His Majesty hasn't had you flogged for your insolence yesterday." Ilara dipped her brush into the bucket without comment, the water now more pink than clear. A droplet of her own blood fell from her fingertip, merging with the dirty water. She didn't flinch, didn't allow her face to betray the agony in her hands or the ache in her knees. This resistance, however small, was all she had left. Across the hall, the king entered through the massive oak doors, surrounded by advisors clutching scrolls and speaking in urgent tones. His gaze swept the room in practiced assessment before landing on Ilara's bent form. For a breath, his conversation faltered. Something crossed his face. Irritation, perhaps, or something more complex. He watched how she worked methodically despite her obvious pain, how her back remained straight even when bowed in labor. "The girl still has spirit," remarked Lord Barnaby, the king's most trusted advisor, following his monarch's line of sight. "Most peasants break by morning." The king's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps we've been too gentle," he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. There was puzzlement there, as if confronted with a problem he couldn't immediately solve. A rare occurrence for a man accustomed to instant obedience. Throughout the day, Ilara was passed from task to humiliating task. In the kitchens, she was forced to pluck birds with her bleeding fingers, the feathers sticking to her wounds. In the stables, she shoveled manure, while the grooms laughed and deliberately startled the horses to make them defecate more. In the servants' quarters, she was given no bed, only straw in a corner where drafts cut through the thin walls like winter's claws. Yet at each station, those who worked closely with her began to notice something strange. She completed each task without complaint. When a young kitchen boy dropped a tray of bread, Ilara stepped forward to take the blame before the cook could strike him. When an elderly laundress struggled with heavy linens, Ilara silently took the weight upon herself, despite her exhaustion. These small acts of kindness, performed without expectation of reward, began to stir whispers among the castle staff. "The king's new pet has a backbone," muttered the head cook, watching as Ilara efficiently cleaned game despite never having done so before. "And a heart," added the laundress, pressing a stolen morsel of bread into Ilara's palm when no one was looking. As dusk approached, Ilara was summoned to serve at the king's private dinner, an unexpected honor that everyone recognized as another opportunity for humiliation. She was given no time to clean herself. Dirt and blood still caked her hands, and the smell of the stables clung to her clothes. The steward's smile was cruel as he pushed her toward the king's chambers. The king dined alone that evening, seated at a table that could have comfortably fit 20. Candles illuminated the room in golden light that danced off the goblets and silverware, creating the illusion of warmth in a space that held none. When Ilara entered, the king glanced up from his documents, his expression unreadable. "Pour the wine," he commanded, gesturing to a crystal decanter. Ilara approached with careful steps, aware of the filth she carried with her into this immaculate space. Her hands shook slightly as she lifted the heavy decanter, the weight pulling painfully at her injured fingers. The red liquid splashed into the goblet, so similar to the blood that had dried beneath her fingernails. "Your hands are bleeding on my tablecloth," the king observed, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," Ilara replied, her voice barely audible. She tried to pull her hands back, but the king caught her wrist in a swift movement, turning her palm upward to examine the damage. His touch was unexpected, not gentle, but not cruel either. Clinical. Assessing. "You've been working all day with these?" he asked, something like genuine curiosity in his voice. "Yes, Your Majesty." Ilara's heart hammered in her chest, so loudly she was certain he must hear it. This close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the slight shadow of beard on his jaw, human details that made him more real and somehow more frightening. Why not ask for bandages? Even beasts of burden are tended when injured. Ilara met his gaze then, a dangerous act that could cost her dearly. "Would you have granted such a request, Your Majesty?" The king's eyes narrowed, but not with anger. He seemed almost intrigued. "You speak to me as if we were equals." "I speak to you as one human soul to another," Ilara replied, then immediately tensed, expecting a blow. None came. Instead, the king released her wrist and leaned back in his chair, studying her with that same unsettling intensity. "Continue serving," he said finally, "then stand there while I eat. Do not speak unless spoken to." For an hour Ilara stood motionless as the king ate methodically, occasionally making notes on his documents. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken tension. Her legs ached, her back screamed in protest, but she remained still, focusing on a point just above the king's head to maintain her composure. Finally, as servants cleared the plates, the king spoke again. "What do you think of the northern border dispute?" he asked suddenly, tapping a document before him. Ilara blinked in confusion. "Sire, you heard me. The northern villages claim my tax collectors take more than the crown's share. The tax collectors claim the villages hide their true yields." His pale eyes fixed on her face. "You're from a village. What do you think?" It was a trap, surely. No matter her answer, it would displease him. Yet something in his expression suggested genuine curiosity. Ilara took a slow breath. "When the harvest fails, Your Majesty, every grain becomes precious. Perhaps what looks like deception to your collectors is simply desperation to feed children through winter." The king's expression darkened, but not with rage, with something more complex. He stood abruptly, causing Ilara to step back instinctively. "You're dismissed." As she turned to leave, the king added, Report to the physician before returning to your duties. Those hands will be useless to me if infection sets in." The next morning, rumors spread through the castle like wildfire. The king's tax decree for the northern provinces had been unexpectedly revised. No one could explain the change, but servants whispered that after his dinner, the king had been heard pacing his chambers for hours. When Alara entered the great hall to resume her cleaning, bandages wrapped around her hands and fresh clothes on her back, the court fell silent. She kept her eyes downcast, but could feel the weight of their stares, curiosity, resentment, and something new, uncertainty. The court dining that evening buzzed with tension. Lords and ladies watched the king with wary eyes as he surveyed his subjects from the high table. When a nobleman loudly complained about peasant sympathies, the room held its breath, waiting for the king's reaction. But he merely raised his goblet, eyes finding Alara where she stood against the wall. "Your insolence will cost you more than you know," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed hall. But something in his tone made the threat sound hollow, almost perfunctory. In the shadows, the Queen Mother's face hardened as she watched this exchange, her bony fingers tightening around her knife. "My son has always had peculiar fascinations," she whispered to her companion. "But this one could prove dangerous to us all." The echoes of Alara's words at the banquet still reverberated through the castle halls 3 days later. The king reigns over an empty throne because he does not know his own people. Servants whispered it in corners when they thought no one was listening. Guards exchanged glances when the king passed. Even the nobles, always quick to forget uncomfortable truths, couldn't seem to shake the simple audacity of a peasant girl who dared speak such thoughts aloud. King Aldrich paced his private study, moonlight streaming through tall windows and casting his shadow long across the floor. The fire had burned low, but he hadn't called for more wood. The chill in the air matched the conflict in his mind. By all rights, the girl should be in the dungeons, or worse. No monarch could allow such insolence to go unpunished without appearing weak. His father would have had her tongue removed for less. And yet, he hesitated. His advisors had been unanimous in their counsel after the disastrous dinner. Lord Barnaby, voice tight with barely controlled outrage, had demanded an example be made of her. "Beheading would be merciful, Your Majesty," he'd hissed, but perhaps too quick to serve as a proper lesson to others. The Queen Mother had been more direct. "Kill the wretch and be done with it," she'd said, her jeweled fingers drumming impatiently on her armrest. "Every moment she draws breath in these walls diminishes your authority." Aldrich's fist struck the oak table, rattling the silver goblet that stood half empty. Wine splashed onto parchments, tax records from the northern provinces he'd been reviewing with new eyes since that night. The truth that gnawed at him was too dangerous to acknowledge. The peasant girl hadn't been wrong. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called, composing his features into the mask of cold authority his subjects expected. His steward appeared, bowing low. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion at this late hour. The girl awaits your judgment, as ordered." Aldrich nodded, his throat suddenly dry. He'd postponed this decision for days, telling himself he was simply busy with more important matters. The lie tasted bitter now. "Bring her." Minutes later, Alara stood before him. The moonlight cast her in silver and shadow, making her appear almost ethereal despite her plain servant's dress. Her hands were still bandaged, he noted, though the wrappings were soiled from continued labor. Dark circles bruised the skin beneath her eyes, yet she stood straight, her gaze neither challenging nor submissive, simply present. "Do you understand what you've done?" Aldrich asked, his voice quieter than he intended. "Yes, Your Majesty." No tremor betrayed fear in her voice, though she must have known her life hung by a thread. "Then you understand I cannot let this pass." He turned away, unable to look at her directly. "My counsel demands your head." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Alara spoke. "What does the king demand?" The question struck him like a physical blow. What did he want? Not her death. The thought turned his stomach. Not her suffering. He'd watched enough of that to know it brought him no satisfaction. The truth was far more dangerous. He wanted to understand how this uneducated village girl could speak with such clarity about matters his lifelong advisors obscured with flattery and complex rhetoric. "Tell me about your village," he said abruptly. Confusion flickered across her face before she composed herself. "Brookhaven is small, Your Majesty, perhaps 50 families. We grow wheat and barley mainly, with some livestock." "Not statistics," Aldrich cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Tell me about the people." Ilara hesitated, then understanding dawned in her eyes. For the first time, he saw something like hope in her expression. "There's old Willem, who lost his sons in Your Majesty's Western campaign, but still leads harvest prayers for the crown's prosperity. Martha Baker, whose bread once won praise from your father's procession, though she's never told anyone but her daughter. The Miller twins, who caught fever last winter. Only one survived." Her voice gained strength as she continued, painting portraits of lives he'd never considered. Children who've never tasted sugar, men who work from dawn until their hands bleed, then rise to do it again. Women who birth babies in the fields during harvest because stopping means starvation. Each word was like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through Aldrich's carefully constructed worldview. These weren't faceless masses, but individuals with dreams and griefs as real as his own. "Enough," he said finally, his voice hoarse. He poured wine with his own hand, another unthinkable breach of protocol, and drank deeply. "You speak of suffering as if it's my doing. Some is, Your Majesty, some isn't." Ilara's simple honesty was more devastating than any courtier's calculated barb. "But all of it happens under your crown." Aldrich felt anger flare, the comfortable, familiar response of a king challenged, but beneath it lurked something far more uncomfortable. Shame. "What would you have me do?" he demanded, the question escaping before he could contain it. "Abdicate? Hand the treasury keys to every peasant with a sad tale?" "I would have you see," Ilara replied, so softly he almost didn't hear. "Just see." Something broke in Aldrich then, some wall he'd built within himself long ago. Images flashed through his mind. His father striking a servant who'd spilled wine, his tutors teaching him that common folk understood only force, his first tax collection as king, when he'd signed execution orders for village elders who couldn't pay, never questioning the necessity. He turned to the window, unable to bear Ilara's gaze. "Leave me," he ordered, his voice rough with emotions he refused to name. But as she moved toward the door, he added, "Not the castle, just this room. Return tomorrow night." The following days passed in a haze of confusion for the court. The king, rather than executing the insolent servant, seemed to have forgotten her entirely. He attended council meetings, reviewed petitions, and dined with nobles as always. Yet observant courtiers noticed subtle changes. Questions about crop yields and winter stores. Frowns when luxury expenditures were proposed. Long silences when tax collectors delivered their reports. And then there were the nights. Palace guards whispered about light in the king's study until dawn. Servants reported finding the girl there in early morning hours, exhausted but unharmed, maps and documents spread between them. "He asks about the villages," the chambermaid confided to the cook. "Wants to know everything, how people live, what they eat, how they survive winter." "Devil's work," the cook muttered, crossing herself. No good comes from a king who questions the natural order. In his private chambers, Lord Barnaby paced furiously while the Queen Mother watched with cold calculation. "It's been a week, Your Grace. He hasn't punished her. Worse, he listens to her, a filthy peasant with no education, no breeding. My son has always been susceptible to novelty," the Queen Mother replied, her voice like silk over steel. "But this fascination endangers everything we've built. The northern lords already whisper of reduced taxes. The Treasury Minister speaks of reallocating resources." Her thin lips curved in disgust. "The girl has bewitched him somehow." "Then we must break the spell," Barnaby declared, "before he destroys the kingdom with peasant sympathies." That night, as Ilara made her way to the king's study, a shadowy figure blocked her path. The Queen Mother emerged from an alcove, her black gown making her seem part of the darkness itself. "Child," she said, the endearment at odds with her icy tone. "You play a dangerous game." Ilara dropped into a curtsy. "Your Grace, I only answer the king's questions. You fill his head with commoner sentiments." The Queen Mother circled her like a predator. He was born to rule, not to concern himself with the petty sufferings of those beneath him. "With respect, Your Grace, a king who doesn't know his people's sufferings rules over strangers." The Queen Mother's hand struck with surprising speed, leaving a red mark on Ilara's cheek. "You forget yourself, girl. The king's temporary fascination won't protect you forever." As the older woman glided away, her final words drifted back like poison. "Choose wisely where your loyalties lie. The throne endures while peasants are forgotten." Shaken, Ilara continued to the king's study. When she entered, Aldrich looked up from a map, his face uncharacteristically animated. "I've been thinking about the northern villages. Their complaints might have merit. If we adjust collection schedules to follow harvest rather than arbitrary dates." He stopped, noticing her expression. "What happened to your face?" Ilara touched her cheek, feeling the heat of the rising bruise. "Nothing, Your Majesty. I was clumsy." Aldrich's eyes narrowed. He crossed the room and tilted her face toward the light. "Who struck you?" The concern in his voice nearly undid her composure. No one had looked at her with genuine care since she'd been taken from her village. "It doesn't matter. It matters to me," he said, the words hanging between them like a confession. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, something dangerous and transformative. For a heartbeat, they weren't king and servant, but simply a man and woman, recognizing something in each other that neither had found elsewhere. Aldrich stepped back first, visibly shaken. "We should continue with the northern provinces," he said, his voice not entirely steady. Outside the study door, Lord Barnaby pressed his ear to the wood, his face contorting with disgust at what he heard. "The king speaks to her of policy," he whispered to the guard captain beside him. "This cannot stand." The captain nodded grimly. "My men report the same. He values her counsel above lifelong advisors." Barnaby straightened, decision hardening his features. "Then we have no choice. The girl will not see another full moon." The marketplace teemed with life, a chaotic symphony of voices haggling over prices, children weaving between stalls, and merchants calling out their wares. Men in rough-spun clothes argued over the quality of tools, while women inspected vegetables with critical eyes, searching for bruises or signs of rot. A street performer juggled wooden pins for copper coins, his face painted in garish colors that made children squeal with delight and fear. No one noticed the hooded figure moving cautiously between the stalls. Beneath the simple brown cloak, King Aldrich's heart raced with an unfamiliar sensation: vulnerability. Without his crown, without his guards, he was just another face in the crowd. For the first time since childhood, he moved through the world unrecognized, invisible. Ilara's words had haunted him for days. "You cannot govern what you do not see." When she suggested this madness, that he witness his kingdom with his own eyes, disguised as a commoner, he'd initially dismissed it as foolishness. Yet here he was, breathing the mingled scents of fresh bread, unwashed bodies, and livestock that defined common life. "3 coppers for that loaf?" A woman near him protested, her face lined with exhaustion. "Last week it was 2. The baker shrugged helplessly. "Grain tax went up. Take it or leave it." The woman dug through her pouch with trembling fingers, counting coins with painful deliberation before reluctantly handing them over. As she turned away, Aldrich saw a young child clinging to her skirts, hollow-cheeked and wide-eyed. Something cold settled in Aldrich's stomach. That was his tax increase, implemented last month on Lord Barnaby's recommendation to fund new tapestries for the eastern wing of the castle. He moved deeper into the market, each interaction revealing truths no council meeting had ever conveyed. Farmers complained of arbitrary seizures by tax collectors who claimed royal authority. A blacksmith spoke bitterly of his son, conscripted for the king's army and never heard from again. A group of elderly men reminisced about the old king, Aldrich's father, with a mixture of fear and respect that made Aldrich's chest tighten. "At least he was predictable in his cruelty," one said, his voice lowered. "This one changes the rules with every season." Aldrich turned away, stomach churning. Is this how his people saw him? Not as a ruler bringing prosperity and justice, but as an unpredictable tyrant whose whims destroyed livelihoods. A commotion near the village square drew his attention. People gathered around a proclamation being nailed to a post by a royal messenger. Aldrich edged closer, curious what decree was causing such murmurs among the crowd. "Another tax?" someone groaned. "Does the king think gold grows alongside our turnips?" "It's for the tournament," another replied. "Says here every village must provide supplies for the nobles' entertainment." Aldrich frowned. He'd approved no such tournament. The messenger finished his task and mounted his horse, clearly eager to escape the growing discontent. As the crowd dispersed, Aldrich approached the notice, reading the ornate script with mounting disbelief. It bore his seal, but he'd never authorized this collection, a special levy for a 3-day tournament to honor the Queen Mother's birthday. "They forge your name often, I imagine," came a quiet voice beside him. Aldrich stiffened, turning to find an elderly man leaning heavily on a gnarled walking stick. The old man's eyes were milky with cataracts, but something in his expression suggested he saw more clearly than most. "What do you mean?" Aldrich asked carefully. The old man gestured toward the proclamation. "The king's men take what they want and blame his majesty. Convenient for them. He sits in his castle, never knowing how his name is used to strip us bare." He spat on the ground. Or perhaps he knows and simply doesn't care. Aldrich opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. What defense could he offer? The truth was worse than this old man's accusations. He hadn't known, and that ignorance was unforgivable. Back at the castle that evening, Aldrich burst into Lord Barnaby's chambers without announcement, the door crashing against the wall. The advisor leapt to his feet, nearly overturning his writing desk. "Your Majesty, this is most irregular." "What tournament?" Aldrich demanded, throwing the crumpled proclamation onto the desk. "I signed no such order." Barnaby's face underwent a remarkable transformation, shock giving way to calculation, then settling into practiced concern. "A small oversight, sire. We discussed it in council last month. Perhaps you don't recall? For your mother's birthday celebration? We discussed no such thing." Aldrich's voice was deadly quiet. "Who else is involved? The treasury minister? The tax collector?" Barnaby's composure cracked slightly. "Your Majesty, these details are beneath your concern. We've always handled such matters. We have been stealing from my people in my name." Aldrich stepped closer, his voice dropping further. "How long has this been happening?" Before Barnaby could answer, the door opened again to admit the Queen Mother, resplendent in crimson silk that contrasted sharply with her silver hair. She assessed the situation with one sweeping glance. "Ah, I see you've learned of your birthday gift to me." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. How thoughtful of Lord Barnaby to arrange the surprise. "Mother," Aldrich turned slowly. "Did you know about this deception?" "Deception?" She laughed lightly, moving to pour herself wine from Barnaby's decanter. "Really, Aldrich, such dramatic language. The kingdom requires proper governance. While you've been distracted with your new pet project, someone must ensure things continue to function." The casual dismissal struck Aldrich like a physical blow. In that moment, he saw his mother clearly, perhaps for the first time. Not as parent, but as politician, calculating and ruthless. "The tournament is cancelled," he said flatly. "The collected taxes will be returned." The Queen Mother's goblet froze halfway to her lips. "Don't be absurd. The arrangements are made. The nobles are traveling as we speak. Then they will turn back." Aldrich's voice hardened. "I am still king, am I not? Or have you and your sycophants decided otherwise while I was distracted?" Tension crackled between them. Decades of unspoken power struggles suddenly laid bare. Finally, the Queen Mother set down her goblet with deliberate care. "The peasant girl has poisoned your mind," she said softly. "You speak of matters you don't understand." "On the contrary." Aldrich moved toward the door. "For the first time, I begin to understand very well." Barnaby stepped forward, panic evident in his features. "Your Majesty, please reconsider. The northern lords are already discontent with the reduced taxation. If you now appear to favor the commoners so blatantly—" "Enough!" Aldrich's shout echoed off the stone walls. "Prepare orders rescinding the tournament tax. Immediately." As he strode through the corridors toward his chambers, a figure emerged from the shadows, Sir Reynard, a knight known more for his loyalty than his intelligence. "Your Majesty," he bowed deeply. "May I have a word?" Aldrich slowed, his mind still churning with anger. "What is it, Reynard?" The knight glanced nervously over his shoulder before speaking. "It's about the girl, sire. Ilara. I've been assigned to guard her, and there's talk among certain guards. Plans I believe you should know of." Aldrich's blood turned cold. "What plans?" "Lord Barnaby instructed Captain Mercer to ensure she meets with an accident before the next full moon." Reynard's voice dropped to a whisper. "The captain has chosen men already." "Where is she now?" Aldrich demanded. "In the kitchen, sire. But she's never alone. They watch her constantly." Aldrich's mind raced, calculating possibilities and dangers. "Why are you telling me this, Reynard? You risk much." The knight met his king's eyes directly. "Because I've seen the changes in you these past weeks, sire. Good changes. The kingdom needs them. Needs you to be the king you're becoming." Something shifted in Aldrich's chest, a weight he hadn't known he carried suddenly lightening. "Find her," he commanded. "Bring her to my private study, discreetly." Later that night, as Ilara stood before him, Aldrich found himself at a crossroads he'd never anticipated. He described what he'd witnessed in the village, the fraudulent tax, his confrontation with Barnaby and his mother. With each revelation, her expression shifted from surprise to validation to concern. "They fear you," she said finally, "not because you're changing, but because they always knew you could. They want you dead." Aldrich countered, the words tearing from him. "Because of me. Because I listened to you." Ilara absorbed this with remarkable composure. Only a slight tremor in her hands betrayed her fear. "What will you do?" The question hung between them, laden with implications neither dared voice aloud. Aldrich moved to the window, gazing out at the kingdom spread below, a kingdom he was only beginning to truly see. "I will be king," he said finally, "not just of the nobles, but of all my people." When he turned back, something in his expression must have changed, for Ilara took an involuntary step backward. "And you," he continued, his decision crystallizing as he spoke, "will help me learn how." Ilara's footsteps echoed against stone walls as she carried linens through the east corridor. Though her movements appeared casual, her senses remained vigilantly alert. The weight of unseen eyes followed her everywhere now. Servants who once smiled in passing now averted their gazes, fearful of association. Guards' hands drifted to sword hilts when she approached. Even the air felt different, charged with whispers and suspicion. 3 weeks had passed since the king's confrontation with Lord Barnaby, and the castle had transformed into a battlefield of silent warfare. Ilara had been reassigned to the farthest wing from the king's chambers, ostensibly to serve elderly noble guests, but the isolation's purpose was transparent. Keep her away from the king, limit her influence, watch her every move. "Girl," a sharp voice called, causing Ilara to freeze mid-step. Lady Cordelia, the Queen Mother's closest confidant, emerged from a doorway like a spider from its web. "Those linens were requested an hour ago. Your tardiness is noted." Ilara dipped into a curtsy, keeping her eyes downcast. "Forgive me, my lady. The laundry fires were slow to heat this morning." "Excuses," Lady Cordelia sniffed, her bejeweled fingers plucking a sheet from Ilara's arms and inspecting it with exaggerated care. "These are inadequately pressed. Take them back and do them properly." Though the linens were immaculate, Ilara had personally ensured their perfection. She knew better than to argue. "Yes, my lady." As she turned to leave, Lady Cordelia's voice dropped to a venomous whisper. "Your little spell over the king weakens by the day, peasant. Soon he'll remember his proper place, and yours." The words were calculated to wound, to plant seeds of doubt. Ilara forced herself to continue walking steadily, though her heart hammered against her ribs. The cruel barb contained a kernel of truth that had been gnawing at her for days. She hadn't seen the king in nearly a week. In the shadowed stairwell leading back to the laundry, a hand suddenly caught her elbow, pulling her into a concealed alcove. Ilara nearly screamed before recognizing Sir Reynard's earnest face. "Speak of nothing important." he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Pretend I'm reprimanding you for dropping something." Ilara nodded minutely, arranging her features into a mask of apologetic distress. "I'm sorry, sir. It won't happen again," she said loudly. Reynard maintained his stern expression while whispering, "The king sends word. Meet him tonight at the old bell tower, after the midnight changing of the guard." His fingers pressed a small key into her palm. "For the servants' entrance. He says you're in grave danger. They grow bolder in their plans against you." Ilara clutched the linens tighter to hide her trembling hands. "I understand my duties perfectly, Sir Reynard," she replied for any listeners, while giving the slightest nod. "See that you do," he growled, then strode away with performative irritation. The day crawled by with excruciating slowness. Ilara completed her tasks mechanically, mind racing with questions and fears. Twice she noticed the same guard following her between duties. Once, she found her meager dinner had a strange, bitter aftertaste that made her discreetly spit the food into her napkin. They were growing desperate, and therefore more dangerous. When the castle finally quieted and midnight approached, Ilara slipped from her pallet in the servants' quarters. The elderly laundress who shared her small room opened one eye but remained silent, turning away to grant tacit permission for whatever secret errand required such stealth. Small kindnesses still existed, even in this nest of vipers. The bell tower stood at the northernmost corner of the castle grounds, long abandoned after newer structures rendered it obsolete. Thick ivy crawled up its weathered stones, and few remembered the narrow servants' passage that wound around its base. The perfect place for a clandestine meeting, or a perfect trap. Ilara hesitated at the tower's shadow, scanning for signs of ambush. The courtyard lay still under a three-quarter moon, silver light casting sharp-edged shadows across the flagstones. Nothing moved save the occasional bat flitting overhead. With a steadying breath, she inserted the key into the ancient lock. The door opened with surprising silence, revealing a spiral staircase illuminated by a single guttering torch. Ilara climbed cautiously, each step creaking beneath her weight. At the top landing, another door stood slightly ajar, warm light spilling through the crack. She pushed it open to find King Aldrich standing by a narrow window, his usual finery replaced by simple dark clothing. The room, once perhaps a watchman's post, had been hastily cleared of cobwebs and dust. A small table held bread, cheese, and wine. "You came," he said, evident relief in his voice. "I wasn't certain you'd trust the message." "I almost didn't," Ilara admitted, remaining near the door. "The castle grows more dangerous by the day." Aldrich's face tightened with anger and something else. Guilt, perhaps. "I know. My mother's faction works tirelessly to isolate me from anyone who supports change. 3 of my loyal guards have been reassigned to border outposts. My food taster now reports to Barnaby instead of the steward." He gestured to the simple fare. "Hence tonight's humble provisions, which I procured myself." Despite everything, Ilara felt a smile tug at her lips. The king, sneaking to the kitchens like a hungry child. The king, discovering there are many paths through his own castle he never knew existed. His answering smile faded quickly. "But we haven't much time. I've discovered their plans for you, and they're worse than I feared." He explained in terse sentences how the Queen Mother's circle had convinced several powerful nobles that Ilara possessed some unnatural influence over the king. Witchcraft, they whispered. Evidence was being fabricated, witnesses paid. A midnight tribunal was planned for the next full moon, mere days away. "A witch trial," Ilara whispered, blood draining from her face. "No defense, no mercy." "Precisely." Aldrich paced the small room, frustration evident in every line of his body. "I could order it stopped, but such a decree would only confirm their whispers that I'm under your spell. They've crafted their trap well." "Then I must leave the castle," Ilara said simply. "Tonight, if possible." Aldrich stopped pacing, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "Is that what you want?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Ilara studied him. This man who had transformed from captor to ally, from tyrant to aspiring reformer. In another life, another world. She pushed the dangerous thought away. What I want doesn't matter. The kingdom needs you to be the king you're becoming. I'm an obstacle to that now. You're the reason for it, Aldrich countered, his voice rough with emotion he clearly struggled to control. He approached her, stopping just beyond arm's reach. Before you, I saw nothing beyond these walls. You gave me sight. The air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken possibilities. For a heartbeat, Ilara allowed herself to imagine a world where the distance between peasant and king could be bridged, where the connection they both felt might be acknowledged without bringing disaster upon them both. Reality crashed back like a wave. Your enemies will use me to destroy you, she said softly. I cannot let that happen. A sound from the stairwell froze them both, the unmistakable scrape of a boot on stone. Aldrich extinguished the lamp with one swift movement, plunging the room into darkness broken only by thin moonlight through the window. Someone followed you, he whispered, drawing her deeper into the shadows. Or you, she countered. The footsteps grew closer, deliberate and unhurried. Whoever approached made no attempt at stealth. They wanted their presence known, their approach dreaded. The door swung open fully and Sir Reynard stumbled through, blood streaming from a gash across his forehead. Forgive me, sire, he gasped, collapsing to one knee. They followed me, Captain Mercer and his men. I led them astray but couldn't shake them entirely. How many? Aldrich demanded, helping the knight to a chair. 6 at least, armed for combat, not patrol. Reynard's eyes found Ilara. They mean to kill her tonight and claim she attacked you, the perfect proof of her malevolent influence. Aldrich's expression hardened into something Ilara had never seen before. Not the practiced authority of the throne room, but something more primal. The face of a man prepared to fight for what he valued. There's a passage behind the tapestry, he said, pulling aside a faded hanging to reveal a narrow opening. It leads to the old monastery grounds beyond the north wall. Reynard, can you still ride? The knight nodded grimly, pressing a cloth to his wound. Take her there. Find Brother Thomas. He owes me a debt. He'll shelter her until I can secure her safety properly. Ilara shook her head. If I disappear, they'll only claim further evidence of witchcraft. Your position will be worse. If you die, Aldrich said fiercely, gripping her shoulders, nothing else matters. The naked emotion in his voice silenced her protests. Below, they heard the tower door crash open, followed by the clatter of armored men ascending the stairs. Go, Aldrich urged, pressing a sealed letter and a small pouch of coins into her hands. I'll delay them. They'll know you helped me escape, Ilara protested. I'm still king, he replied with grim determination. Let them try to challenge that directly. As Reynard pulled her toward the hidden passage, Ilara looked back one last time. Aldrich stood facing the door, no longer the sheltered monarch, but a man awakened to his own power and purpose. Their eyes met across the darkened room, a moment of perfect understanding without words. Then the passage closed behind her, and Ilara fled into the night, carrying with her both the fear of pursuit and the burning memory of a king who had found his true crown in the eyes of a peasant girl. The great hall blazed with torchlight, illuminating the faces of nobles gathered for an emergency council. Tension hung in the air like smoke, thickening with each passing moment. 3 days had passed since Ilara's escape, and the castle still buzzed with conflicting rumors. She had bewitched the king. She had attempted to assassinate him. She had fled with royal treasures. Each version grew more outlandish than the last. King Aldrich sat motionless on his throne, watching the assembled nobility with a stillness that unnerved even his closest advisors. His face betrayed nothing, but beneath his composed exterior, fury and calculation battled for dominance. The council had not been his idea. Lord Barnaby and the Queen Mother had called for it, ostensibly to address the peasant crisis. In reality, Aldrich knew it was a carefully orchestrated performance meant to corner him publicly. Your Majesty, Lord Barnaby's voice sliced through the murmurs, we cannot ignore the gravity of recent events. A servant girl, a commoner brought to the castle as an example of proper subjugation, has corrupted the royal court, influenced policy against noble interests, and now fled justice like the criminal she is. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. Aldrich noted which lords nodded most vigorously, mentally adding names to a growing list of enemies disguised as allies. The girl's influence has been concerning, added Lord Hemsworth, an elderly noble whose vast northern estates made him a powerful voice. Taxes reduced in peasant districts while noble houses bear increased burden. Royal guards questioning our authority on our own lands. Commoners growing bold, speaking of rights and justice, as if such concepts apply to them. The Queen Mother sat slightly to Aldrich's right, her fingers tapping a slow rhythm on the arm of her chair. "My son," she said, her voice honeyed poison, "has always had a generous heart, perhaps too generous. This girl exploited that rare quality, as commoners will always exploit kindness, mistaking it for weakness." Aldrich allowed the accusations to pile up, one atop another, watching the trap being constructed around him. To defend Ilara now would only confirm their suspicions. To denounce her would betray everything he had come to believe, everything she had helped him see. When the cacophony of complaints reached its peak, Aldrich raised one hand. The hall fell silent instantly. "You speak of this girl as if she wielded some mystical power," he said, his voice deceptively soft. As if a king could be so easily swayed by a single voice. He rose from the throne, descending the dais steps with deliberate slowness. "What frightens you more, my lords? That a peasant girl might influence royal policy, or that your king might actually see the kingdom he rules?" Uncomfortable shifting spread through the assembly. Aldrich continued his slow circuit of the hall, making eye contact with each noble in turn. "I visited the villages," he said, disguised, anonymous. "I saw children too weak from hunger to stand. I saw tax collectors taking double their due and calling it royal decree. I saw lords' men flogging farmers for falling short on quotas after blight destroyed half their crop." Lord Barnaby stepped forward, face flushed with indignation. "Your Majesty, these are isolated incidents." "Are they?" Aldrich cut him off. "Or are they the foundation upon which our comfort is built?" He gestured to the opulent hall, the golden goblets, the silk-clad nobility. "We feast while they starve. We debate their worthiness while they build our castles, harvest our food, die in our wars." The Queen Mother rose, her face a mask of controlled fury. "You speak treason against your own class, Aldrich." "I speak truth, Mother, a truth I was blind to until recently." He turned back to the assembled nobles. "The girl you fear so much did nothing but ask me to look with my own eyes. If that is witchcraft, then perhaps we should question what spell kept me blind for so long." A dangerous silence followed his words. Lord Barnaby and the Queen Mother exchanged glances. This was not proceeding as they had planned. The king was not defensive or confused. He was challenging them directly. Lord Hemsworth broke the silence, his lined face grave. "Your Majesty speaks of commoners with unusual passion. Perhaps the rumors of unnatural influence have some merit." Several nobles nodded, murmuring agreement. Aldrich recognized the strategy. They couldn't attack him directly, but they could question his soundness of mind, his fitness to rule. The trap was closing. "You mistake clarity for madness," Aldrich replied, returning to his throne. "But let us speak plainly, since you lack the courage to do so. You fear change. You fear losing the privileges you've enjoyed at others' expense. You fear a king who rules for all his subjects, not merely the wealthy few." "We fear a king bewitched by a peasant witch," someone shouted from the back. Aldrich's hand slammed down on the arm of his throne. "Enough!" The hall went deadly silent. "You want the girl?" Aldrich's voice was cold as midwinter frost. "Let her come and speak for herself, before all of you. Let her face these accusations directly." Shocked gasps rippled through the assembly. The Queen Mother half rose from her seat, face pale with fury. "You would give a common criminal a voice in royal council?" "I would give justice a voice," Aldrich countered. "Or do you fear what she might say?" Lord Barnaby recovered first, his courtier's mask sliding back into place. "A generous offer, Your Majesty, but the girl has fled. Captain Mercer's men found no trace beyond the monastery grounds." Aldrich allowed himself a thin smile. "Then send riders, offer pardon for her return, guarantee her safety to speak before this council." "And if she has truly bewitched you," pressed Lord Hemsworth, "how can we trust your judgment in this matter?" The question hung in the air, The true challenge finally spoken aloud. Questioning the king's fitness to rule was treasonous, yet cloaked in concern for his well-being, it became permissible. Aldrich leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous register that forced everyone to listen closely. "If you believe me unfit to rule, Lord Hemsworth, there are traditional ways to challenge the crown. I invite you to try them." The old lord blanched, taking an involuntary step backward. The invitation to open rebellion, so calmly delivered, shocked the assembly into silence. "No? Then we proceed as I have decreed. Find the girl. Bring her to court under my personal protection. She will answer your accusations, and you will listen." The Queen Mother's voice cut through the tension. "And after she has spoken? What then, my son?" Aldrich met his mother's gaze unflinchingly. "Then this council will decide her fate, and perhaps mine as well." The gamble was enormous. If Alara could not be found, or worse, if she were found by those who wished her dead before she reached the castle, his position would be weakened beyond recovery. Yet it was the only move that might break the deadlock without civil war. "The council is adjourned," Aldrich announced, rising from his throne. "Riders will depart at dawn." As the nobles filed out in uneasy silence, the Queen Mother remained seated, watching her son with cold calculation. When they were alone save for the guards, she spoke in a voice meant only for him. "You would risk everything, your crown, your kingdom, your birthright, for a peasant girl." It wasn't a question, but an indictment. Aldrich turned to her, seeing not the fearsome Queen Mother, but an aging woman clutching desperately to fading power. "I risk everything for the kingdom I now see clearly. Whether that includes you, Mother, depends on choices you have yet to make." He left her there, rigid with shock at being addressed as anything less than untouchable. As he strode through the corridors toward his chambers, Aldrich felt a strange lightness despite the danger. For the first time in his life, he was truly king, not merely wearing the crown, but carrying its weight with purpose. In his private study, Sir Reynard waited, his wounded forehead now healing beneath a simple bandage. "It's done, Your Majesty," he reported quietly. "Brother Thomas delivered her safely to the meeting point. Your letter reached Lord Davian as planned." Aldrich nodded, relief washing through him. Lord Davian, a distant cousin who held lands beyond the mountains, was one of the few nobles he trusted implicitly. "And she is well?" Frightened but resolute. Reynard hesitated. "She asked me to tell you she understands what you risk by helping her. She says..." The knight looked uncomfortable. "She says her life is not worth your crown." Something tightened in Aldrich's chest, pain mingled with a fierce, unnamed emotion. "She's wrong," he said quietly. "Some things are worth more than crowns." Reynard nodded, a new understanding in his eyes. "The council seeks to trap you. If she returns..." "When she returns," Aldrich corrected, "everything changes, for all of us." Outside the window, the moon hung nearly full in the night sky. 5 days until the council would reconvene. 5 days to prepare for a confrontation that would determine not only Alara's fate, but the future of the kingdom itself. "Get word to Lord Davian," Aldrich instructed. "Tell him to prepare Alara for what's coming. She must be ready to face them all, and to speak her truth, no matter the consequence." As Reynard departed on his secret mission, Aldrich turned to the window, gazing at the distant lights of the village beyond the castle walls. Out there, his people continued their lives, unaware that their fate hung in the balance of a battle being waged in hushed voices and calculated moves. "I see you now," he whispered, a promise to them and to himself. "I will not look away again." Dawn broke over the castle with reluctant fingers of light that seemed to hesitate before touching the stone walls. In the king's private chambers, no fire had been lit despite the morning chill. Aldrich had dismissed his servants hours ago, preferring solitude as he prepared for the day ahead. The council would reconvene at midday, the moment of reckoning he had both dreaded and anticipated for 5 sleepless nights. He stood at the window, watching as the castle slowly awakened below. Servants scurried across the courtyard carrying baskets of bread and pitchers of water. Guards changed shifts with practiced precision, armor glinting in the early light. Everything appeared normal, yet nothing was. The air itself seemed to vibrate with tension, as if the very stones knew something momentous approached. A discreet knock interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called, not turning from the window. The door opened to reveal Sir Reynard, his face drawn with exhaustion. The knight bowed hastily, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Your Majesty, she's here. Lord Davian brought her through the eastern postern gate before dawn. They await your word in the old armory, as instructed." Something unfurled in Aldrich's chest. Relief, fear, anticipation. "Any sign of trouble?" "None yet. But the Queen Mother's spies are everywhere. We cannot keep her hidden long." "We don't need long." Aldrich finally turned from the window, his decision crystallizing. "Bring them both to me, now." As Reynard departed, Aldrich moved to his desk, penning final instructions with swift, decisive strokes. Whatever happened in the council chamber today, he would be prepared. The pieces were in place. All that remained was the courage to move them. Minutes later, Ilara stood before him, her simple peasant dress replaced by attire befitting a merchant's daughter, practical but respectable. Lord Davian, a bear of a man with a silver-streaked beard, hovered protectively at her side. But it was Ilara who captured Aldrich's attention completely. Her face was thinner, her eyes shadowed with fatigue, yet she carried herself with quiet dignity that no royal courtier could match. When their eyes met, the world around them seemed to recede, leaving only the unspoken understanding that had grown between them. "You came back," he said simply. "You asked me to." Her voice was steady, revealing nothing of the fear she must feel. Lord Davian cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, I must register my protest. Bringing her into this viper's nest is necessary," Aldrich finished firmly. "And her choice, I believe." Ilara nodded. "I cannot hide forever, and I will not let others fight battles I should face myself." Aldrich gestured for them to sit, then outlined the situation in terse sentences. The nobles were divided. Some, swayed by the Queen Mother and Lord Barnaby, clamored for Ilara's execution as a witch. Others, disturbed by the king's recent changes but reluctant to commit treason, remained uncertain. A precious few, mostly younger lords who had seen the suffering in their own domains, cautiously supported reform. "The council today is a crucible," Aldrich explained. "Whichever way it tips, the kingdom follows." "And if it tips against you?" Ilara asked quietly. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Aldrich met her gaze steadily. "Then I am prepared to pay that price." "I won't let you sacrifice yourself for me," she protested. "This isn't about you or me anymore." He leaned forward, intensity blazing in his eyes. "This is about the future of the kingdom, whether it will be ruled by justice or privilege, compassion or cruelty." Lord Davian shifted uncomfortably. "Fine sentiments, Your Majesty, but sentiments don't stop daggers. The Queen Mother won't surrender power without blood." "I know my mother well," Aldrich replied grimly. "Better than she knows me, I think." He rose and moved to a carved wooden chest in the corner of the room. From it, he withdrew a simple circlet of silver, not the ornate crown of state, but an older symbol of royal authority that predated the current dynasty. "In the council chamber, you must speak your truth, Ilara, no matter how they threaten or cajole. Tell them what you've seen, in your village, in the castle, in the kingdom. Hold nothing back." Her hands trembled slightly as she nodded. "And then? And then we face whatever comes together." He handed her a sealed parchment. "If all else fails, give this to Lord Hemsworth. He values tradition above all else, even above his loyalty to my mother." The bells began to toll midday as they finished their preparations. Sir Reynard returned, his face grave. "The nobles assemble, Your Majesty. And the Queen Mother has brought the royal confessor, Father Milton." Aldrich's expression hardened. Father Milton was a fanatic known for his ruthless witch trials in the northern provinces. His presence could mean only one outcome was acceptable to the Queen Mother: Ilara's condemnation. "Then we mustn't keep them waiting." Aldrich straightened his shoulders, the mantle of kingship settling visibly upon him. To Ilara, he added softly, "Remember, no matter what happens in that chamber, you have already changed this kingdom for the better." The great hall fell silent as King Aldrich entered, not from the royal antechamber as tradition dictated, but through the main doors, walking among his nobles as an equal rather than descending from above as their superior. The calculated breach of protocol sent a ripple of discomfort through the assembly. More shocking still was the woman who walked half a step behind him. Ilara, head held high despite the hostility radiating from the gathered nobility. She wore no finery, sought no protection beyond the king's presence, yet something in her bearing commanded attention. The Queen Mother's face tightened with barely controlled fury. Lord Barnaby whispered urgently to his allies. Father Milton watched with the detached interest of an executioner assessing his subject. Aldrich took his place at the center of the chamber rather than ascending to the throne. "My lords and ladies," he began, his voice carrying to every corner, "you demanded that this woman face your accusations. She returns of her own free will to do so." "Under what protection?" demanded Lord Barnaby. "A witch has no rights in this kingdom." "Under mine," Aldrich replied simply. "And she has not been proven a witch, merely accused by those who fear change." Father Milton stepped forward, his gaunt figure swathed in black robes that seemed to absorb the light around him. "The Church recognizes certain signs of witchcraft, Your Majesty, unnatural influence over men of power, sudden changes in governance that weaken established authority, mysterious knowledge of matters beyond one's station." He circled Ilara like a vulture, though he kept a cautious distance. "This woman displays all these signs. She arrived as a servant, yet within weeks was advising the crown on matters of state. The king, known for his firm hand, suddenly becomes an advocate for peasant rights after her arrival. Coincidence? I think not." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. The trap was being sprung exactly as Aldrich had anticipated. "If influence through honest counsel is witchcraft," Aldrich countered, "then half the men in this room are warlocks." "Or do you suggest that only nobles may advise their king?" Father Milton's eyes narrowed. "The devil speaks through the lowborn, Your Majesty. Their blood lacks the divine right that flows through noble veins." A tense silence followed this bold statement of class superiority. Some nobles nodded agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably, aware of the dangerous ground being tread. "Let the accused speak," called Lord Hemsworth from his place among the elder nobles. "If we are to judge, let us at least hear her words." All eyes turned to Ilara. The silence grew thick enough to choke on as she stepped forward, somehow appearing both vulnerable and indomitable. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. "I have no magic but the truth," she began. "I was born in Brookhaven Village, daughter to a farmer who worked land his grandfather tilled before him. I have 3 younger brothers who go to bed hungry more nights than not. My mother died of fever 2 winters ago because we couldn't afford the physician's fee." She paused, her eyes sweeping the assembly. "This is not a unique story. It is the story of your kingdom, the kingdom beneath your castles and banquet halls, the kingdom that plants your food, builds your homes, fights your wars, and buries your dead." Father Milton moved to interrupt, but Lord Hemsworth raised a hand, silencing him. "Continue, girl." "When the king took me from my village, I hated him," Ilara admitted, turning to meet Aldrich's gaze directly. "I saw in him every lord who had ever taken without giving, every noble who passed our suffering without seeing. But then something unexpected happened." He listened, not out of guilt or pity, but with a genuine desire to understand. She turned back to the assembly. "The crime you accuse me of is showing your king the truth of his realm. If that is witchcraft, then the spell was cast long before I arrived, cast by those who deliberately kept him blind to his people's suffering." The Queen Mother rose from her seat, cold fury emanating from her like winter frost. "Enough of this peasant rhetoric. She bewitches us even now with honeyed words. I call for her immediate—" Silence. Aldrich's command cut through the chamber like a blade. "You demanded she speak. You will hear her fully." For a heartbeat, mother and son locked eyes in silent battle of wills. Then, remarkably, the Queen Mother sank back into her seat, though hatred blazed in her eyes. Ilara continued, her voice stronger now. "I am no witch. I am simply someone who dared speak truth to power. And your king, your true king, was great enough to listen." She reached into her simple dress and withdrew the sealed parchment Aldrich had given her earlier. "Lord Hemsworth, the king entrusted this to me, for you." The old lord approached cautiously, breaking the royal seal with reverent fingers. As he read, his weathered face paled, then flushed with emotion. This changes everything." "What is it?" demanded Lord Barnaby, starting forward. Lord Hemsworth held up the document, his hand trembling slightly. "Evidence. Tax records showing systematic theft by Crown officials. Ledgers documenting how noble families, including my own, have been stealing from royal coffers and peasant villages alike for generations." His voice broke. "And proof that the Queen Mother has been orchestrating it all." Chaos erupted in the chamber. Accusations flew like arrows. Former allies turned on each other as self-preservation overwhelmed loyalty. Amid the storm, Aldrich stepped to Alara's side, his voice meant for her alone. "Whatever happens now, know this: you have already won. The truth cannot be buried again." She looked up at him, seeing not a king but the man he had become. "What happens now?" Aldrich took her hand in full view of the stunned court, a gesture that silenced the room instantly. "Now," he said, his voice carrying to every corner, "we rebuild the kingdom. Together." The village of Brookhaven stirred with unusual activity as dawn broke over the eastern hills. People emerged from thatched cottages earlier than their normal routines dictated. Children were scrubbed clean despite protests, and women arranged wildflowers in clay pots outside doorways. An air of nervous anticipation hung over the humble settlement like morning mist. "He won't come," old Willem declared from his perch on the well's stone edge, his gnarled hands resting on a walking stick polished by years of use. "Kings don't visit villages unless they're burning them." Martha Baker clucked her tongue as she adjusted her best apron. "You haven't heard then? Ella's with him, our Ella. Servant girl or not, she's still just a girl," Willem countered, though doubt crept into his voice. "And he's still a king." The debate ended abruptly as a child came running down the village's main path, bare feet kicking up dust. "They're coming! Horses on the North Road!" Families poured from their homes, arranging themselves along the village's central green with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Some clutched humble offerings: freshly baked bread, autumn apples, hand-woven cloth. Others simply stood with hands clasped before them, uncertainty written across weathered faces. None knew what to expect from this unprecedented royal visit, announced only days ago by a messenger who seemed equally bewildered by his assignment. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, and then the royal procession appeared around the bend in the road. The villagers gasped collectively. This was no grand parade of opulence as they had feared. Instead, a small group of riders approached, led by King Aldrich himself. He wore simple riding clothes, his crown absent, only a silver circlet marking his royal status. Beside him rode a figure that made the villagers murmur in disbelief: Ilara, daughter of Brookhaven, dressed not as a servant, but in a riding habit of muted green that marked her as neither peasant nor noble. More shocking still was the king's expression as he surveyed the village. No disdain, no detached curiosity. Instead, his eyes held something the older villagers had never witnessed from nobility: genuine concern. The procession halted at the village green. For a moment, no one moved. The divide between monarch and subjects yawned like an uncrossable chasm. Generations of subservience and fear couldn't be bridged by a single gesture. It was Ilara who broke the stalemate. She dismounted first, her movements sure despite the fine clothes that must have felt strange after a lifetime in homespun. She approached a woman standing frozen at the front of the gathered crowd, her father's sister, who had raised Ilara's brothers after their father's injury. "Aunt May," she said softly, taking the older woman's trembling hands in hers. "I've brought someone who needs to see." King Aldrich dismounted then, approaching with careful steps. The villagers bowed awkwardly, unused to proper court protocol. He raised a hand. "Please stand. I come not for ceremony, but for truth." May stared at him, decades of ingrained deference battling with maternal protectiveness. "What have you done with our Ella?" she asked, the words escaping before she could stop them. A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd at such directness, yet the king didn't bristle. Instead, a faint smile touched his lips. "She has taught me more than all my royal tutors combined," he answered simply. "And now I must see what she has described, the reality of life beyond castle walls." For the next hours, King Aldrich walked among the people of Brookhaven, guided by Alara and welcomed with increasing warmth as initial terror gave way to cautious hope. He entered their homes, sat at their tables, listened to their struggles. He held newborn infants and clasped the gnarled hands of elders. He examined the failing mill wheel and the bridge washed out in spring floods. He saw the unmarked graves of those lost to hunger and illness. In the village square, as midday approached, the king helped distribute bread from the communal ovens, a symbolic act that brought tears to the eyes of hardened farmers who had never expected to break bread with their monarch. "Your taxes will be adjusted to follow harvest cycles," he announced to the gathered villagers. "No more will collectors come demanding coin when crops are still in the field. A portion of royal stores will be distributed to villages facing hunger before winter sets in, and I will establish local councils where your voices can be heard directly, without noble intermediaries." Stunned silence greeted these pronouncements. Such changes were beyond anything they had dared hope for, even in whispered prayers. Old Willem, who had remained skeptical throughout the visit, finally approached the king, leaning heavily on his stick. "Fine words, Your Majesty," he said, caution evident in his rheumy eyes. "But words fall away like leaves in autumn. What guarantee have we that these promises won't be forgotten once you return to your castle?" The directness of the question created a moment of tension. Guards shifted nervously, hands moving toward sword hilts. But Aldrich raised a hand to still them. "A fair question," he acknowledged. "Words alone mean little after generations of broken promises." He turned to Alara, something unspoken passing between them before he continued. "Which is why I've come with more than words." He gestured, and one of his attendants brought forward a wooden chest. From it, Aldrich withdrew a document bearing the royal seal. "This charter establishes new law throughout the kingdom. It guarantees basic protections for all subjects, noble and common alike. Limits on taxation, rights to fair treatment, channels for grievances to reach the crown directly." He handed the document not to the village headman as protocol would dictate, but to Alara. "And to ensure these laws are upheld, I am establishing a new position within the royal court, voice of the commons, someone who knows the struggles of ordinary people and has the courage to speak truth to power." Alara's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Your Majesty, will you serve your king and your people in this way, Alara of Brookhaven?" Aldrich asked, his voice carrying to every ear in the suddenly silent square. The question hung in the air, laden with implications that rippled far beyond this single moment. What he proposed was revolutionary, giving formal power to a commoner, creating a position that would stand as equal to noble advisors. "I am just a farmer's daughter," Alara said softly. "I have no education, no training in statecraft." "You have something far more valuable," Aldrich countered. "You see with clear eyes unclouded by privilege. You speak without fear when truth is needed. The finest scholars in the kingdom can teach you statecraft, but courage and compassion cannot be taught." As murmurs spread through the crowd, Aldrich added, his voice pitched for her alone, "I need you, Alara, not just as an advisor, but as a reminder of who I must be, who I want to be, as king." The personal plea behind the public request was unmistakable. Something shifted in Alara's expression, a recognition of what remained unspoken between them. This position offered a bridge across the impossible divide of their stations, a way to remain in each other's lives that the world might accept. "I will serve," she answered finally, her voice steady despite the emotions visible in her eyes. "For my people and for my king." Cheers erupted from the villagers, the sound swelling until it echoed against distant hills. Old Willem wiped a tear from his weathered cheek. Children danced in circles around the royal guards, who found themselves smiling despite years of stern training. As the celebration continued around them, Aldrich and Alara stood together, the charter between them, a symbol of the new world they hoped to build. "This is just the beginning," Aldrich said quietly. "The nobles who opposed us haven't surrendered. My mother has retreated to her ancestral lands, gathering allies. Lord Barnaby fled to neighboring kingdoms, seeking support for rebellion." "I know," Ilara replied. "The path ahead will not be easy." "No," he agreed, "but for the first time, it is the right path." As evening fell and the royal party prepared to return to the castle, villagers lined the road with lit candles, a traditional farewell usually reserved for beloved neighbors departing on long journeys. Ilara rode beside her king, no longer a servant but not quite his equal, occupying a space that had never existed before in the rigid hierarchy of the realm. Behind them followed her younger brothers and aunt, invited to live in the castle where the boys would receive education alongside noble children. At the crest of the hill overlooking Brookhaven, Aldrich reined his horse to a halt for one last look at the village twinkling with candlelight in the gathering dusk. The sight stirred something profound in his chest, a connection to his kingdom he'd never felt from the remote heights of his throne. "You once told me I ruled over an empty throne because I did not know my own people," he said. "You were right." Ilara studied his profile in the fading light, seeing not the cold monarch who had once terrified her, but a man transformed by the courage to change. "And now?" "Now the throne has meaning," he answered, "because I understand what and who I serve." The deeper truth remained unspoken between them, how a king's heart had awakened alongside his conscience, how a servant girl had found power in her own voice. Some truths were too delicate, too profound for words. Some transformations could only be lived, one choice at a time, one day after another. As they turned their horses toward the castle, Ilara carried with her the weight of her new responsibility and the lightness of newfound purpose. The king rode beside her, no longer her captor, but her ally in a struggle larger than either of them. Behind them, the village of Brookhaven glowed with hope in the deepening twilight. One small light in a kingdom being reborn through the unlikely bond between a peasant's wisdom and a king's awakening heart. Sometimes the most profound changes begin with a single voice brave enough to speak truth to power. Ilara's journey from captive servant to trusted advisor reminds us that courage isn't measured by the strength of one's position, but by the willingness to stand firm when everything, including your life, is at risk. Would you have found such courage in her place? Would you have spoken truth when silence offered safety? King Aldrich's transformation asks us an equally challenging question. When confronted with uncomfortable truths about our own blindness, do we defend our comfortable ignorance, or do we summon the humility to change? The hardest journey isn't across distant lands, but across the chasm between what we've always believed and what we finally come to see. True leadership begins when we recognize that power without compassion is merely force, and force without justice cannot stand. If this story touched your heart, remember that in our own world, there are still voices waiting to be heard and powers that need to be questioned. Share this tale with others who might find their own courage within it. Follow our channel for more stories that illuminate the shadows between power and justice, love and duty, the world as it is and the world as it could be. Like, share, and join us again for another journey through the landscapes of the human heart.